What if I told you that the second largest country on Earth was basically created because nobody could agree on anything? Welcome to Canada, where saying sorry became a national identity and compromise turned into an art form. From its very beginning, Canada has been a story of people who probably should not get along somehow finding a way to make it work. And trust me, this journey is way more dramatic than you think. Before starting our video, please subscribe our channel and comment. Like the video, let us rewind about 15,000 years. Long before anyone was arguing about French versus English or debating constitutional amendments, this land was home to hundreds of distinct indigenous nations. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Cree and the Inuit and the Haida and the Blackfoot were not just scattered tribes. They were sophisticated societies with complex governments and trade networks spanning thousands of miles, and yes, their own traditions of diplomacy and compromise. The Haudenosaunee, for instance, created one of the world's oldest participatory democracies where different nations came together under the Great Law of Peace. Sound familiar? This concept of different groups maintaining their identity while working together would become Canada's entire vibe, though it would take centuries and countless mistakes to get there. Fast forward to 1534, Jacques Cartier plants a cross in Gaspé and claims the land for France, probably while the local Micmac people watched and thought, well, this is awkward. But here is where Canada's story diverges from other colonial tales. The French who settled here, including the habitants and coureurs des bois and missionaries, quickly realized something important. You cannot survive Canadian winters without help. New France became a place of cultural mixing. French traders married Indigenous women. They learned Indigenous languages and survival techniques and trade practices. The fur trade was not just an economic system. It was Canada's first major exercise in compromise and cooperation. Sure, it was far from perfect, and European diseases devastated Indigenous populations, but the foundation was being laid for a society where different cultures would have to figure out how to coexist. Then came 1759, and everything changed. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham lasted just 15 minutes, but its consequences would shape Canada forever. Britain conquered New France, and suddenly you had a massive French-speaking Catholic population under British Protestant rule. This should have been a disaster. In most places, it would have meant forced assimilation or rebellion. But here is where compromise enters the chat. The British, still reeling from losing their American colonies, decided to try something radical with the Quebec Act of 1774. They let French Canadians keep their language and religion and civil law system. Was this pure generosity? Absolutely not. It was pragmatic compromise. Keep Quebec happy so they do not join the American Revolution. And guess what? It worked. Speaking of the American Revolution, let us talk about the 40,000 loyalists who fled north, refusing to join the rebellion. These were not just random refugees. They were people who chose compromise and gradual reform over revolution. They literally voted with their feet for a different kind of society. Then came the War of 1812, where Canadians, both French and English, and British soldiers and Indigenous allies fought together against American invasion. Nothing unites people like a common threat, right? This war gave Canadians something crucial: a shared identity based on not being American. Canada would be the place where you did not throw tea in harbors. You sat down and talked about it over said tea. By the 1860s, the province of Canada, which included modern Ontario and Quebec, was basically ungovernable. French and English politicians were deadlocked on everything. The government fell repeatedly. Sound familiar to anyone following modern politics? The solution: make the problem bigger. The fathers of Confederation, and yes, they were all fathers because 1867 came up with a wild idea. Unite several colonies into one country, but give each province significant powers. This was not a unified nation-state like France or a federation like the United States. It was something in between, a compromise. The British North America Act of 1867 created a federal system where provinces controlled education and cultural matters, which was crucial for Quebec while the federal government handled national issues. It was messy and complicated and absolutely brilliant. John A. Macdonald, who became Canada's first prime minister, famously said he wanted a strong central government. George Etienne Cartier, representing Quebec, insisted on provincial rights. The result, they both got some of what they wanted and neither got everything. That is compromise, baby. But let us be real. Canada's history of compromise has some dark chapters, and westward expansion is one of them. As Canada stretched from sea to sea, the government's treatment of Indigenous peoples was anything but compromising. The numbered treaties were often signed under duress, and promises were broken, and the residential school system, which lasted until 1996, attempted to erase Indigenous cultures entirely. The Red River Rebellion of 1869 and the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, led by Louis Riel and the Metis people, were desperate attempts to negotiate a place in Confederation. Riel was hanged as a traitor, becoming a martyr in Quebec, and a symbol of how compromise sometimes meant the powerful compromising among themselves while ignoring others. This tension between Canada's ideals and its actions toward Indigenous peoples remains the country's greatest ongoing challenge. The World Wars tested Canadian unity like nothing before. In World War I, the conscription crisis of 1917 nearly tore the country apart. English Canada largely supported mandatory military service, while Quebec vehemently opposed it. Prime Minister Robert Borden forced it through anyway, and the political wounds lasted generations. But these wars also pushed Canada toward independence. By World War II, Canada had its own foreign policy and its own military command and growing confidence. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 had already made Canada legally independent, but it took decades for the country to fully embrace that identity. Even independence was gradual, very Canadian. The 1960s brought the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, where the province rapidly modernized and secularized. Moters chez nous, which means masters in our own house, became the rallying cry. Some Quebecers asked, why compromise at all? Why not just separate? The October crisis of 1970, when the FLQ kidnapped politicians and murdered Quebec's deputy premier, was Canada's darkest moment of political violence. Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, and suddenly tanks were in Montreal streets. But even this crisis led to more compromise through official bilingualism and recognition of Quebec's distinct society, and ongoing negotiations about Quebec's place in Canada. The 1980 and 1995 referendums on Quebec's sovereignty both failed. The second one lost by less than 1%. Canada came within 54,000 votes of breaking apart, but it did not. Why? Because enough Quebecers believed that compromise, however frustrating, was better than separation. The 1980s brought another defining moment. Pierre Trudeau wanted to patriate the Constitution and bring it home from Britain, where it had technically remained since 1867. This sounds simple, but it required getting all the provinces to agree. Spoiler alert, they did not all agree. The Constitution Act of 1980 finally made Canada fully independent with its own amending formula. It included the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which protected individual rights while acknowledging collective rights for Indigenous peoples and linguistic minorities, but Quebec never signed it. Even today, Quebec has not officially agreed to the 1982 Constitution. And yet Canada keeps functioning. That is the compromise nation for you. Canada's official multiculturalism policy, adopted in 1971, essentially said you do not have to choose between your heritage and being Canadian. You can be both. It is a compromise between the American melting pot and European ethnic nationalism. Does it always work perfectly? No, but it has allowed Canada to become one of the world's most diverse nations while maintaining relative social peace. Immigration transformed Canada throughout the late 20th century. People from every corner of the globe made Canada home. The country went from being predominantly British and French to a true mosaic of cultures. Cities like Toronto and Vancouver became among the most multicultural on Earth. This was not accidental. It was policy born from the idea that diversity could be a strength if managed through respect and compromise. Today, Canada faces its history more honestly than ever before. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which concluded in 2015, documented the horrors of residential schools and issued 94 calls to action. This is compromise in its most profound sense, acknowledging past wrongs and listening to those harmed and working toward a better relationship. The discovery of unmarked graves at former residential school sites shocked the nation and the world. These revelations forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable truths about their history. Reconciliation is not a destination, but an ongoing process. It requires Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians to find new ways of relating to each other and sharing the land. Land acknowledgements have become common. Treaties are being renegotiated. Indigenous languages are being revitalized. Self-government agreements give Indigenous communities more control over their futures. Is it enough? Many would say no. But it represents a shift toward the kind of nation-to-nation relationship that should have existed from the beginning. Regional tensions and federal balance. Canada's regional diversity creates constant tension. Western provinces often feel ignored by central Canada. Atlantic provinces struggle with economic challenges. Quebec continues to assert its distinct identity. The territories push for more autonomy. And Ontario sometimes forgets it is not the whole country. These tensions are not bugs in the Canadian system. They are features. The constant negotiation between federal and provincial governments and between regions and between linguistic communities keeps the country dynamic. It is exhausting and frustrating and absolutely essential. Without these conversations and compromises, Canada would likely have fractured long ago. So what is Canada really? It is a country that was never inevitable and never obvious and never finished. It is a place where people who could have gone their separate ways kept choosing to stay together even when it was hard. Where peace and order and good government replaced life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness as founding principles. Canada is proof that you do not need a revolution to build a nation. You do not need one dominant culture or one unifying language. You just need people willing to listen and negotiate and accept that nobody gets everything they want, but everyone gets something. Is Canada perfect? Absolutely not. The gap between its ideals and reality, especially regarding Indigenous peoples, remains vast. But the Canadian experiment continues. Can diverse people share a massive territory and respect their differences and build something together? For over 150 years, the answer has been a qualified and complicated and very Canadian yes, but. And honestly, that might be the most honest answer any nation can give. Please subscribe, comment. Thanks for watching.